Every man on Wall Street feared her ledger more than a pistol. She could topple railroads, bend banks to her will, and outlast the richest dynasties of the Gilded Age. Yet, in the same breath, she pinched pennies with a ferocity that made paupers look extravagant. One candle for heat, oatmeal for supper, the same black dress until it nearly fell apart. How could the richest woman in America live like this? The paradox was so sharp that newspapers had no better name for her than the Witch of Wall Street. But Hetty Green's story was more than caricature. It was born of childhood rejection, sharpened in courtrooms where her reputation was dragged through the mud and forged in panics that ruined other men. She would rescue the system itself when Morgan faltered and die with a fortune rivaling Rockefeller's, only to see her children scatter it in excess or charity. Was she a monster of miserliness, or the first true master of value investing, decades before Buffett? Tonight, we peel back the myths and follow the life of the widow who made fear and thrift her empire.
Whale and port, and give you to some land sharks to board and fit you out singing low.
Henrietta Howland Robinson was born on November 21st, 1834, in the seafaring town of New Bedford, Massachusetts, into a world of Quaker discipline and whaling riches. Her father, Edward Mott Robinson, had married into the mighty Howland family, one of the wealthiest whaling dynasties in New England, and like many men of his class, he longed for a son to continue his name. When his wife Abby delivered a daughter instead, Edward's disappointment hardened into indifference so cruel that he refused to even look upon the child. When Hetty's younger brother died in infancy, Edward's last hope for a male heir vanished, and her mother collapsed into depression, leaving Hetty adrift before she had learned to walk. At the age of 2, the child was sent to her grandfather Gideon Howland and her austere Aunt Sylvia Ann, whose house contained more ledgers than lullabies. Gideon's eyesight was failing, and 6-year-old Hetty became his eyes, reading aloud the financial pages of the Boston Post, the prices of whale oil, the insurance rates for vessels bound around the Horn. While other little girls practiced embroidery, Hetty learned the cadence of compound interest. At 8, she opened a bank account with coins she had hoarded from gifts. By 13, she was tallying her father's maritime accounts with precision that startled grown men. The discipline of Quaker upbringing taught her that wealth, if it meant anything, was to be multiplied quietly, not flaunted. Yet beneath that religious severity burned the psychological scar of rejection. Modern minds might call it status anxiety. The daughter treated as a mistake, resolved to prove she could wield money better than any son. The family's counting houses, the smell of whale oil casks, the creak of ships setting out for Arctic hunts. All these became her schoolrooms, her textbooks. Male merchants would blink in disbelief as this thin teenager corrected their arithmetic, and though they smiled politely, behind their eyes they felt an unease, as if Providence had made an error putting such gifts in a girl. But Hetty carried on, storing nickels, memorizing freight rates, calculating dividends, already sensing that her weapon in life would not be charm, but capital. Later she would say that she never cared for music or novels, that she'd always preferred the sound of figures read aloud in proper order. It was not an affectation. It was survival, a way to create armor against the world that had denied her a father's affection and a mother's warmth. This childhood forged the paradox that would define her, a woman capable of amassing millions, but unwilling ever to spend them on comfort. By the time she reached her late teens, while her contemporaries attended teas and refined their French, Hetty was haunting Boston counting houses, following her father to warehouses where barrels of oil and bales of cotton shifted hands. She absorbed the rhythms of commerce, the brutal logic that fortunes could be made or lost overnight at sea. The older men might chuckle at her presence, but they also came to dread the sharp questions she posed, questions no genteel daughter was supposed to ask. And so, by the time she stepped into adulthood, Hetty Green was already an anomaly in American history. The girl who had turned rejection into discipline, loneliness into focus, bitterness into a ledger's perfect balance. Yet for all her discipline, she was still her father's daughter, and one day Edward Robinson would hand her a sum of money for the traditional purpose of luring a husband. What she did with it would scandalize her family and mark the first public sign that this quiet New England girl was no ordinary heiress. When Hetty turned 20, her father placed $1,200 in her hands, a sum intended for a trousseau, the gowns, gloves and fineries required to secure a husband of proper standing. Most young women of her class would have rushed to Boston's tailors and milliners, parading silks and lace to display their family's prosperity. Hetty, however, saw the gesture not as a dowry, but as capital. She spent barely $200 on serviceable clothes, plain but durable, and with the remainder she bought government bonds. Her father, incredulous, purchased an expensive wardrobe to save her from humiliation, only to watch her sell the garments and invest the proceeds as well. This defiance was more than thrift. It was a declaration that she would never submit to society's script for women of fortune. "My Quaker upbringing disciplined me against pomp and show," she would later remark. To her, money was not for display, but for compounding, the silent engine of power. In those years, she attended Friends Academy and later Anna Cabot Lowell's finishing school in Boston. But while her peers rehearsed their curtsies, Hetty studied ledgers. She followed her father into counting houses, sat in warehouses where the smell of salt fish and oil filled the air, and learned to watch the faces of brokers as closely as she studied the figures on their contracts. By adolescence, she could quote freight rates from memory, an ability that unnerved seasoned traders. This unusual education produced an investor's instinct in a woman barely out of girlhood. When relatives whispered that she was unladylike, she hardened further, convinced that charm and flattery were luxuries that weakened judgment. Modern psychology might call it confirmation bias. Her early belief that money was security became the filter through which she interpreted every decision. The more she was mocked, the more she retreated into the cold arithmetic of finance. And yet, though she seemed immune to ridicule, each rejection deepened her mistrust of social approval, pushing her toward an isolated life where only numbers could be trusted. This singular focus soon collided with the expectations of her kin. The Howland Robinson clan had built its wealth on whale oil, a commodity that by mid-century was already declining in importance as petroleum emerged. To secure her future, Hetty needed not only inheritance, but skill. That skill she possessed in abundance, but fortune often comes wrapped in scandal, and in Hetty's case, the betrayal would come from the very woman who had raised her. In 1865, when her beloved Aunt Sylvia died, leaving an estate worth $2 million, some $40 million in today's terms, Hetty expected to inherit as a favoured niece. Instead, she discovered the will split the fortune among charities and institutions, leaving her only a partial share in trust. For Hetty, who had spent childhood as Aunt Sylvia's shadow, this was not merely a financial slight, but an emotional wound. A repudiation of loyalty. She would not accept it. Producing a document she claimed was an earlier will from 1862, which left her the entire estate outright. Hetty presented it to the courts. That document contained a clause annulling all later wills, and if it were valid, it would make her sole heiress. The executor, Thomas Mandel, immediately accused her of forgery. Thus began one of the most sensational trials of the century, Robinson versus Mandel in 1868. The case would not only decide her fortune, but brand her reputation forever. Newspapers swarmed, charities rallied, and for the first time, the American public fixed its gaze on this severe New England woman who dared to seize millions by challenging her own blood. What unfolded in the courtroom would forever alter how the nation perceived Hetty Green, and would cement the paradox of a woman both brilliant and despised. The Robinson versus Mandel trial of 1868 unfolded like a morality play staged in the heart of Boston, where whispers of greed and betrayal carried as much weight as the law itself. Hetty Green walked into the courtroom determined to prove that her Aunt Sylvia's fortune was hers by right, brandishing the disputed 1862 will as her shield. To her it was simple. Sylvia had raised her, confided in her, relied on her as both companion and assistant. Surely the wealth should pass to the niece who had kept vigil at her side. But to the executors, it was equally simple. The new will was a fraud, concocted by a woman whose appetite for money knew no restraint. The drama intensified when the opposition summoned Benjamin Pierce, the eminent Harvard mathematician, to the stand. Pierce had pioneered the use of statistical analysis, and for the first time in American legal history, mathematics was applied to question handwriting. Examining 42 samples of Sylvia's signature, he concluded with chilling precision that the 1862 document contained improbably repeated downstrokes, marks that no natural hand could have produced. The jury listened as science dismantled Hetty's claim. When the verdict came, it was devastating. The document was forged, and Hetty's reputation lay in tatters. The press seized the story, painting her not as a wronged heir, but as a schemer willing to rob orphans and hospitals to enrich herself. Cartoons depicted her clutching stolen wills, her eyes cold with avarice. Even in victory, the executors were astonished at how thoroughly public opinion turned against her. To be branded a forger in the moral climate of post-Civil War America was to be damned as both dishonest and unfeminine. Yet Hetty never wavered in her insistence that she had been cheated. Friends, few though they were, claimed she truly believed the will was genuine, perhaps a copy she thought authentic. But belief did not matter. Perception did. The humiliation scarred her permanently, teaching her that society's goodwill was a fragile currency, easily withdrawn. She retreated further into suspicion, seeing enemies in every lawyer, rivals in every relative. In psychological terms, one might call it hypervigilance, the mind's attempt to guard against betrayal by expecting it everywhere. But there was also steel in her response. While her name blackened in society pages, Hetty plotted a reinvention. If Boston's Brahmins would not accept her, she would seek legitimacy in the only arena where results silenced gossip: finance. Marriage became her next calculation. Unlike other heiresses, she did not dream of a husband's fortune. she sought a partner who would grant her cover to operate in Wall Street's masculine world while leaving her capital untouched. Edward Henry Green, a wealthy merchant from Vermont, seemed a suitable choice. Older, prosperous, and captivated by her fierce independence. But Hetty would enter marriage on terms no woman of her day had dared demand. A prenuptial contract would keep every dollar of her assets separate, an idea so radical that lawyers had to craft new language to make it binding. If Edward agreed, it was perhaps out of infatuation, or perhaps because he underestimated the will of the woman beside him. In 1867 they married, and almost immediately Hetty began reshaping her destiny. The scandal of the forged will would never leave her. Newspapers would revive it at every opportunity. But she had found a way to move forward. She would not fight in courtrooms, but in counting houses. And in London, where she and Edward soon settled, she would attempt one of the most audacious financial plays of her career, a gamble on the very survival of the United States dollar . Hetty first encountered Edward Henry Green not in a ballroom or family parlour, but through the web of mercantile connections that tied New England to far-off seas. Edward was a Vermont-born trader who had built a respectable fortune in the Philippines, a man seasoned by long voyages and international exchange. Unlike the young suitors, who found Hetty's bluntness disconcerting, Edward seemed intrigued by her direct manner and amused by her disregard for convention. He was older, steady in appearance, and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to navigating storms, both literal and financial. Their courtship was brief, more pragmatic than sentimental. Hetty spoke little of romance, but much of money. Edward, perhaps flattered by her sharpness, admired her audacity. To outsiders, their pairing looked unusual, a famously plain and frugal woman alongside a man of cosmopolitan trade, but it made a certain sense. In 1867, they married, and while society whispered about her dowdy dress and lack of ceremony, the couple began their life together with a measure of contentment. They settled for a time in London, choosing distance from the shadow of Hetty's American scandal, and it was there that family life began. Their first child, Edward Howland Robinson Green, called Ned, was born in 1868, followed by Sylvia in 1871. Hetty doted on them in her own unsentimental fashion, more protective than affectionate, determined that her children would never be hostages to fortune as she felt she had been. London offered not only privacy, but access to the world's greatest financial markets, and Hetty seized the chance. While Edward enjoyed the circles of American expatriates, dining and discussing trade, Hetty immersed herself in bonds and bullion, studying America's battered credit in the wake of the Civil War. US government bonds lay scorned in London's financial houses, traded at half their value, as investors doubted the Republic would honour its debts in gold. Where others saw disaster, Hetty saw certainty. She believed that America, desperate to preserve its reputation abroad, would pay in gold rather than paper, and she quietly began buying when others fled. Her patience defied the culture of speculation. While Edward's friends sought fast profit, she was content to wait. The gamble paid off spectacularly. When President Ulysses Grant signed the Public Credit Act in 1869, affirming redemption in gold, the value of her holdings soared. In a single stroke, she made more than $1 million, silencing skeptics who had laughed at her purchases. London bankers, accustomed to dealing with flamboyant American speculators, found her discipline bewildering, as if she spoke a language of capital that belonged to another century. This victory marked the crystallization of her philosophy. Buy when the world is panicking, hold when the crowd is blind with fear, and sell only when hysteria runs the other way. It was a creed that would guide her for the rest of her life. Yet beneath the triumph lay tension. Edward, though comfortable, lacked Hetty's severity. He enjoyed society, relished display, and took risks she would never tolerate. Their marriage, begun in mutual curiosity, would over time reveal a widening gulf in temperament. For now, however, the Greens returned to America, buoyed by wealth and confidence. It was the 1870s, and Wall Street awaited. There, Hetty would take her London-forged strategy into the very heart of American finance, staking her claim not as a wife or heiress, but as a rival to the most powerful men of her age. Returning to America in the 1870s, Hetty Green carried with her not only a reputation hardened in London, but a strategy sharper than any broker's blade. She chose not to establish an office under her own name, nor to surround herself with clerks and gilt-framed ledgers as the male financiers did. Instead, she worked from a single borrowed desk at Chemical National Bank in New York, where her massive deposits ensured her welcome. There, amid the bustle of ordinary banking customers, she spread her papers in the mornings and sat in her plain black dress, eyes scanning figures with an intensity that unsettled onlookers. She had one advantage few rivals possessed: enormous reserves of cash. While speculators lived on borrowed credit, stretching themselves thin in pursuit of quick profit, Hetty sat patiently on liquidity, waiting for the tremors of panic. The financial tremors Hetty Green had long awaited finally arrived in 1873. A year etched into America's memory like a scar that never healed. An entire generation had believed the railroads would lead to paradise. Ever expanding, ever borrowing, ever profitable. Farmers mortgaged their land to send goods to distant markets. Workers poured savings into bonds. Families placed their trust in local banks. When the financial panic struck in the autumn of 1873, it did more than collapse banks and shut down exchanges. It wiped out a generation's faith in the system. J. Cook and Company, one of the country's most powerful banking houses, fell under the weight of unsold railroad bonds, and with its collapse, confidence evaporated like smoke. In New York, thousands lost their jobs within weeks. Entire factory districts went silent, doors locked and windows boarded. At Tompkins Square, workers marched to demand jobs, only to be met with mounted police clubs and tear gas, one of the first major crackdowns on labor in modern American history. On the streets, the number of child beggars grew by the day. Newspapers described filthy, ragged children standing motionless in the rain. In Philadelphia, former shopkeepers burned their ledgers on the sidewalk, saying, "Deeds and debts are nothing now but ash." Men who once held positions of respect now stood in breadlines, hollow-eyed. One mother in Pennsylvania wrote in her diary, "I had never seen my husband cry until yesterday morning when he held up his savings book and saw nothing left inside but despair." Across the Midwest, farmers abandoned their fields, packed up their belongings, and rode freight trains in search of work, only to find factory gates shut and the same answer everywhere: no more positions. And it was into this desolation that Hetty Green stepped like a shadow moving against the tide, refusing to let pity cloud her judgment. She didn't trample the suffering of others, but neither did she mourn. To her, opportunity was born in panic, and money belonged in the hands of those clear-eyed enough to guard it. She quietly bought bonds that had fallen to just 30 to 40 cents on the dollar. She lent money but never called in debts harshly. because she knew a living debtor was still an asset that could yield returns. Foreclosed homes in Chicago, St. Louis, New York, fell into her hands like autumn leaves. And even though she could seize an entire portfolio in one stroke, she still rode third-class trains, carried a tin lunchbox, and rejected all forms of luxury. Her fortune swelled while the nation starved. To many, it seemed heartless, but to Hetty, it was discipline. She believed that money was only safe in the hands of those who truly understood its value, and history proved her right. She walked the streets of Chicago and St. Louis herself, inspecting foreclosed properties, refusing comfort, even as she pieced together the empire that would one day define her. People called her someone who knew how to profit from the downfall of others. But Hetty responded coldly. "I don't speculate. I just keep money until the world needs it most." The press has always rushed to caricature her. They dubbed her the Queen of Wall Street, sometimes with admiration, often with ridicule. But beneath the political cartoons lay a grudging truth. In a time when men panicked, one solitary woman outplayed them all. And now it's your turn to connect with history as a viewer of this video. What about you? Has your family ever lived through an economic downturn? Do you carry memories of cutting back, losing a job, or having to choose between two essentials? Share your real story in the comments, because it's from those very memories that we understand why some choose fear, and others, like Hetty Green, choose readiness. By the early 1880s, Hetty Green stood as a paradox. While Hetty stood publicly as a symbol of iron discipline and financial power, behind closed doors, her marriage was quietly fracturing, a crack no investment could ever mend. Edward Henry Green, once a steady merchant, had grown restless in the shadow of his wife's discipline. He longed for recognition, for the glitter of society that Hetty spurned. Where she clutched liquidity like a shield, he reached for leverage, wagering fortunes on the rising star of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. For a time, the gamble seemed bold rather than reckless. The American economy was rebounding from the long depression. Credit was flowing again, and Edward tasted the thrill of speculation. But speculation is a banquet with poisoned wine. In 1884, a fresh panic erupted, born of fragile banks and overextended railroads. New York's financial district descended once more into chaos. Firms closed their doors overnight, and clerks spilled into the streets carrying boxes of worthless paper. In Brooklyn, a hardware store owner wrote to his brother, "We open at dawn to a crowd of men pleading to return tools they no longer have work for." Across Manhattan, men who just months earlier had invested in rail stocks now huddled in parks, whispering rumors of which bank might fail next. Edward's bets imploded. His debts mounted to $500,000, a staggering figure in any age. Worse still, he had secretly pledged some of Hetty's securities as collateral, a betrayal as intimate as infidelity. When the bank sought to seize her funds to cover his ruin, Hetty exploded. She stormed into court, not to shield her husband but to protect her own capital, suing to separate her assets from his obligations. The spectacle was humiliating for Edward, who now appeared as a reckless gambler, undone by the very woman who should have been his refuge. Society gasped, but Hetty did not flinch. To her, family bonds did not outweigh fiduciary duty. A husband might falter. A balance sheet could not. She granted him a small allowance, but the marriage was effectively finished. Edward, broken in health and spirit, withdrew to Vermont, living quietly under the shadow of his wife's fortune until his death years later. Hetty, meanwhile, emerged from the scandal harder than before. She would never again tether her wealth to another's judgment, never again allow sentiment to threaten solvency. It was a lesson carved from humiliation, one that deepened her mistrust not only of men, but of society itself. Newspapers sharpened their caricatures, depicting her as a witch devouring her husband's fortune, but she carried on, unmoved. What mattered was not the gossip of the crowd, but the compounding of her capital. Yet the very ruthlessness that fortified her empire also hardened her children's world. Ned and Sylvia grew up watching a father fade into obscurity and a mother wage war, not with affection but with contracts. For Hetty, this was prudence. For her children, it was a lesson that money, not love, was the glue that held life together. And it was a lesson that would echo in their choices long after she was gone. Still, as the dust of 1884 settled, the woman they called the Queen of Wall Street strode forward unbroken, her fortune larger than ever, her reputation darker than ever. But the public had not yet seen the full force of her contradictions. For when she became a widow in all but name, Hetty Green would step fully into the role society had carved for her, not a wife, not a mother, but the Witch of Wall Street, a figure both feared and reviled. And her children, particularly Ned, would one day pay the price for living in the long shadow of her iron will. By the mid-1890s, the name Hetty Green was no longer spoken with curiosity, but with a mixture of awe and derision. In the press, she was no longer merely the Queen of Wall Street, but the Witch of Wall Street, a title that clung to her like soot. She wore it unwillingly, yet her own appearance seemed to feed the myth. After the public lawsuit and the irreparable fracture in their relationship, Edward Henry Green withdrew to Vermont, carrying with him a weakened heart and a shattered reputation. He spent his final years in silence, quietly watching his wife, the woman who shed no tears for love but remained unfailingly lucid with numbers, rise ever higher on Wall Street. In 1902, Edward died of chronic heart and kidney disease. There was no grand funeral, no lengthy eulogy. His death closed the chapter on a marriage that had begun as a strategic alliance, only to become a silent battlefield. After Edward's death in 1902, she adopted mourning clothes permanently, the same frayed black dress and veil that she mended until threadbare, a costume that only reinforced her image as miserly and strange. Reporters had a field day. They painted her as a monster who lived on oatmeal, refused coal, and hid millions in secret pockets sewn into her skirts. To the public, the sharp-eyed woman carrying a tin lunchbox was an unsettling paradox. Richer than almost anyone alive, yet living as if she had been condemned to poverty. Reporters delighted in cataloguing her habits, some exaggerated, but many rooted in truth. She ate oatmeal, eggs and raw onions, often cold, refusing to burn coal or boil water because fuel cost money. She carried her lunch in a tin box or bought the cheapest fare from street vendors, preferring a few cents worth of crackers to a restaurant meal. Her daily rhythm was mechanical. She rose before dawn in her modest rented room, ate a frugal breakfast, walked to the ferry and reached Chemical National Bank before most clerks had arrived. There she spread her papers on the same borrowed desk, worked for hours in silence, and left only when daylight was gone. The uniform never changed. Black dress, patched and repatched until it was more stitch than fabric. She distrusted comfort as if it were a contagion. Fear, too, guided her life. Convinced that lawyers and rivals plotted against her, she moved her residence and even her office repeatedly, once abandoning a location because she suspected poison in her food. Securities were carried on her person, stitched into hidden pockets so she could never be separated from her wealth. These eccentricities made her a legend in her own lifetime. To some, she was the ultimate miser, proof that obsession with money corrodes the soul. To others, she was a model of discipline, a woman who refused to let excess corrupt her judgment. The newspapers predictably preferred the grotesque caricature, crowning her the Witch of Wall Street and sketching her as a gaunt hag hoarding gold while chewing raw onions in the dark. The caricature reached its most vicious form in the story of her son, Ned. As a boy, he injured his leg in a sledding accident, and rumours soon spread that his mother, too cheap to pay for proper medical care, disguised him in rags to seek treatment at charity clinics. The infection worsened, and amputation followed. To the press, it was the perfect symbol of her cruelty, an empire of millions, and yet a boy losing his limb because of a mother's stinginess. But reality was more complex. Hetty did consult physicians, even expensive specialists, but medicine in the late 19th century offered few effective treatments for bone infection. Antibiotics were still decades away. Many boys of Ned's generation would have lost a leg under the same circumstances. Yet Nuance never sold newspapers. The image of Hetty Green as the miser who let her son's leg be cut off was too sensational to resist, and it haunted her reputation more than any financial scandal. For Ned himself, the loss became both a curse and a symbol. He grew into a large man with a booming voice and an artificial leg, carrying both his mother's fortune and her notoriety. He called her mother with respect, but he also absorbed the lesson that money came before sentiment. Sylvia, more reserved, lived in the quiet shelter of her mother's fortune, rarely attracting notice. But both children inherited not only wealth, but the peculiar burden of being shaped by a mother whom society scorned even as it feared her. Hetty herself seemed unmoved. She loaned money to banks, to railroads, even to municipalities, but she never loaned her heart. In her mind, the rumours and caricatures were irrelevant, numbers told the truth, and numbers never lied. Yet behind the arithmetic, a deeper irony was forming. For all her brilliance, all her discipline, her legacy was being written not in the language of balance sheets, but in headlines and jokes, in cruel cartoons that taught the public to fear her as something unnatural. And that raises a question worth asking today. Was she vilified because of her character? Or because she was a woman who dared to do what men did without apology? Had a Rockefeller or a Morgan sent a son to a charity clinic, would history have called it shrewdness or cruelty? Tell me, do you think the press judged Hetty Green fairly? Or did society need a witch to explain its discomfort with a woman holding so much power? In the autumn of 1907, New York City trembled. A speculative scheme to corner United Copper stock had collapsed, sending shockwaves through a fragile banking system already stretched thin. Trust companies faltered, depositors lined up in panic, and within days, the Great Knickerbocker Trust closed its doors. The nation's financial heart seized. Clerks carried boxes of ledgers down Wall Street steps as crowds surged in despair. In working-class districts, wages went unpaid, factories shuttered, and families crowded soup kitchens that grew longer by the hour. I have never seen men's eyes so empty. wrote one reporter, describing the queues of jobless New Yorkers staring at bread they could not buy. At City Hall, even municipal payrolls teetered on default. Into this turmoil stepped J.P. Morgan, summoning the nation's most powerful bankers to his library on Madison Avenue, yet even his circle strained to find cash enough to stem the tide. And then the whispers began. There was still one figure in New York with liquidity unmatched, one woman whose hoarded millions might stabilize the city. Hetty Green was summoned. She arrived without entourage, in her threadbare black dress, walking past gilded carriages into a world of men desperate for salvation. From her satchel, she produced the only weapon that mattered: cash. At the height of the crisis, she loaned New York City over $1 million to keep the government running, its policemen and firemen paid, its doors open. She lent to banks and brokers as well, not at extortionate rates, but at fair terms, ensuring both survival and her own profit. Newspapers, half disbelieving, reported that the Witch of Wall Street had become, if only briefly, its guardian angel. Yet she herself dismissed sentiment. "I always try to deal justly with everyone, to meet my obligations on time, and to protect my reputation," she said. "And I keep cash because when the world breaks, only cash still speaks." In that bleak October, the world needed her more than Morgan. Still, the irony lingered. At the very moment she was proving indispensable to the American financial system, society continued to laugh at her onions, her tin lunchbox, her refusal to light a fire. She was saving banks in daylight and mocked as a miser in print by night. But her intervention left no doubt the richest woman in America was also the most formidable. And that leads us to ask you, the viewers who have lived through 2008, through COVID, through shocks that rattled your own savings. When crisis comes, who do you trust more? The showmen who boast in prosperity, or the quiet ones who hold back until the moment of need? Tell me what you think. A woman who saved the financial system but was portrayed as a witch. Was that the justice of history or prejudice? By the 1910s, Hetty Green was an old widow. Her strength was spent, her body drained by illness and age, yet she clung to numbers as if they were her last breath. On Wall Street, young clerks whispered of her as the shadow in the marble hall. A frail woman, slow of step, yet capable of releasing sums large enough to keep an entire bank from collapse. No longer did her patched black dress surprise anyone. What unsettled them was her relentless endurance, in pain, dizzy, suspicious of all and yet present every day, sitting silently at her familiar desk. At the very moment when American women were marching for the right to vote, Hetty chose another form of presence. No speeches, no slogans, only cash and the power it commanded. She was wealthier than ever. By then her holdings stretched across railroads, mortgages and municipal bonds. Yet her body bore the toll of decades of self-denial. She lived with a painful hernia that she bound with sticks rather than submit to surgery, still convinced that doctors were thieves. She suffered dizzy spells, moved constantly between lodgings to avoid supposed assassins, and kept Securities sewn into her clothing like a knight-carrying armor under rags. In 1915, when a physician examined her condition and suggested an operation for $150, she stormed out, muttering that "You are all alike, robbers." A year later, her health failed completely. On July 3, 1916, she collapsed after what friends said was a furious argument with a maid over the price of skim milk. The richest woman in America, a financier whose fortune rivaled Morgan's, died not in a mansion, but in a modest room, still dressed in black. She left behind an estate estimated between $100 and $200 million, an astronomical sum, equivalent to billions today. Newspapers announced her death with a mixture of fascination and mockery. Some praised her genius as an investor, others sneered that she had lived like a pauper and died as the world's greatest miser. On July 3, 1916, Hetty Green's long vigil ended. She died in New York City at her son Ned's home, felled by a stroke, or perhaps a chain of smaller strokes that had shadowed her final years. There was no lavish ceremony, no cascade of mourners dressed in finery. Her funeral was deliberately simple, almost stark, in keeping with the life she had chosen. Yet in a twist of irony, it was Ned who organised the journey north, placing her body aboard his private rail car and carrying her to Bellows Falls, Vermont. It was a gesture of grandeur she herself relished, but which Hetty would likely have scorned. There, beside her husband Edward, she was laid to rest. The gravestone bore no monument, no proclamation of empire. It read only Hetty H.R. Green, his wife. A line so plain it seemed to erase the fiercest woman Wall Street had ever known. No marble library bore her name, no university carried her patronage. What she left was not philanthropy, but an estate valued between $100 and $200 million, divided equally between her children. Ned, ever the showman, spent with abandon, yachts, jewels, parties, inventions, until his portion dwindled. Sylvia, more reserved, gave her share quietly to hospitals, libraries and charities, transforming her mother's guarded hoard into a public trust. Thus, the fortune Hetty had guarded like a dragon's gold scattered in two opposite directions, one of extravagance, one of generosity. Her name faded as others rose, Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, because she had built no institutions to preserve it. Yet, her methods, her iron patience, her refusal to gamble remain etched into the DNA of modern investing. Was her life a triumph? Or was it proof that money, no matter how fiercely protected, can never truly be controlled? History has a way of softening men while sharpening women. J.P. Morgan, who bullied presidents, is remembered as a titan of finance. Andrew Carnegie, who crushed strikes, is celebrated as a philanthropist. Hetty Green, who asked for no statues, founded no universities, and endowed no libraries, is remembered mostly as a miser in black. It is tempting to say Hetty failed, to call her life a cautionary tale of greed without joy, of money without purpose. But to do so would be to ignore the deeper truth. She carved a space for a woman in the harshest arena of her age, beating men at their own game, in their own house, with their own rules. She proved that gender could not bar genius, and for that she paid the price of vilification. Perhaps the real question is not whether Hetty Green lived wrongly, but whether society could ever forgive a woman who lived with such unapologetic clarity. And so her story lingers, not as an epitaph, but as a mirror, showing us our own unease with power, money, and the choices we make about both. As you reflect on her life, consider this. When wealth and family collide, when security and compassion pull in opposite directions, which would you choose? And if history were to write your legacy in headlines and caricatures, what truth would remain beneath the ink? The lesson of Hetty Green is not only financial, but human. Wealth without purpose can corrode, discipline without compassion can isolate. Yet her story also warns us not to accept caricature too easily, for beneath the satire of The Witch of Wall Street lay a pioneer whose methods shape investing to this day. So, I leave you with this question. If history were to judge you not by your intentions but by your habits, what image would remain? Would the world remember your sacrifices or mock your eccentricities? If Hetty's story moved you, consider watching our documentary on the Vanderbilts, the dynasty that built palaces of marble but could not keep their fortune. For in the end, every empire, whether guarded or squandered, faces the same reckoning. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next episode with even more surprising stories.